Welcome everyone to Polycarp's Paradigm. My name is Eric Robinson. I'm with Jared Dobbs today. And Jared and I met through my work at Source and Summit. And we both on the phone found out that we were converts to the Catholic faith from Protestant backgrounds. So I wanted him to be on the podcast. So welcome, Jared, to Polycarp's Paradigm.
Thank you. Good to be with you, Eric.
Yes. Well, give us a little background on yourself. What are you up to these days? And who is Jared Dobbs,
Yeah. Well, nowadays I do a couple of things. I'm going to law school in Sacramento, California at McGeorge School of Law. I just finished my second year of law school. I also attend Presentation Parish here in Sacramento, and I work in the liturgy. I try and do about one mass a week to help volunteer, and I've really gotten to know and appreciate the work of Adam Bartlett, your boss, and I'm slowly trying to be, making the liturgy and a little more antiphonal, adding the communion antiphons and things like that. So it's been really good.
That's awesome. Well, okay, you have a very interesting background. How did you grow up religiously? Like, what was your upbringing like?
I have a really wonderful evangelical family, and a really wonderful evangelical heritage that goes back many generations.
Wow.
My great grandmother, on my mom's side, just full-blooded Assyrian, which is a religious minority, just like the ones you hear in the Bible. The Assyrians were an early Christian people, just like the Armenians, these kind of ancient Christian people groups. And they suffered a lot of persecution at the beginning of the 20th century. Think like the Armenian genocide. So there were other Christian groups at that time that also suffered. And so kind of in the wake of that, they came over to the United States about 100 years ago in pursuit of religious freedom. And that kind of faith and that kind of just devotion out of suffering, something that has always inspired me. And that's something that I, was kind of always in the back of my mind is, what kind of Christian I am. I also grew up very much in a very intact biological family, but I was also in a very progressive part of the country, in a very part of the country where that was not very common. And so that was something that was, as I grew older, I really came to have an interest in family issues and issues of marriage, because I saw that I had been given this sort of gift that most people didn't get. Most people my age, growing up as a millennial, had a much kind of tougher time of things in regards to family issues. Other things when I was little growing up that were very formative for me included Awana.
I've heard of that. I didn't do it, but I've definitely heard of it.
No.
Yeah.
So it's a Bible memory program that evangelicals do, like roughly K through 6, but it goes on beyond that. And I did it, and I mean, like every week, I'd have a Bible memory verse. I can, like, all the Bible verses that I know, most of them are learned in that window of time in my life. And so that gave me a real, a good foundation in many ways.
And were you Baptist at the time, or what kind of evangelical Protestant were you?
Yeah, Baptist. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah. But I always describe myself situate myself within evangelicalism.
Yeah. And what location were you in?
In Northern California.
Northern California.
So
okay.
Name of my hometown is Ukiah.
Yeah, you're right. It is progressive there in California, to say the least.
Yeah. So I had a great upbringing, and I loved my evangelical heritage. And so when I went off to college, I decided to go off to evangelical school to Biola University in Southern California. I majored in music and poli-sci. And so as I was studying, politics and working through politics, this is kind of the era of basically a lot of cultural upheaval regarding marriage issues, family issues. Proposition 8, was under attack in the courts at the time when I was in college. And for those who don't know, in California, Proposition 8 is the marriage amendment that had defined marriage as the union of one man and one woman. And I kind of zoned in on these issues for some reason. It became a kind of personal, intellectual quest to sort of figure out what I thought on these things. And there's something about growing up a millennial, because we're so shaped by the internet that we can kind of research our way to particular thinkers in a particular subculture that we're not necessarily from or that we've not necessarily heard of, but just by kind of Googling the right thing, you sort of find your way to things. So I think there was some of that going on. And my roommate introduced me to this website called First Things, which I'd never heard of before, but it's very prominent kind of Catholic and evangelical ecumenical discussion on politics and what it means to, live in the city in our day and age. I was really attracted for a while, to libertarianism. And so the idea of, marriage is just something that maybe we kind of agree to disagree on. And there's even talk among some evangelicals even about this idea, maybe we should just kind of civil union everyone. But none of this actually, I never quite bought into that. I had trouble with that. And it was predominantly Catholic thinkers, primarily Ryan Anderson at the Heritage Foundation in his book, along with Sharif Girgis and Robbie George, the book, What is Marriage, that really crystallized a view for marriage that was much more deeply grounded in philosophy, much more deeply grounded in Aristotelianism, this idea that marriage is the comprehensive union uniting man and woman as husband and wife to be father and mother to any children their union produces, is ultimately rooted in something unique about the marital act, versus other forms of sexual expression that aren't oriented toward procreation. This was the really first time that I saw, and I knew, when I saw this, I was like, that there's something kind of Catholic-y about that. There's something kind of because what you're saying is if the marital act is what is oriented toward procreation, then something like contraception, is that marital? And if I'm an evangelical, do I believe even in marriage, having non-marital acts of sexual, there was kind of that really kind of was like a little flag, I'll just flag that. That's kind of interesting. Just an interesting sort of question to kind of tag for later.
Yeah, it's interesting because in the Protestant world, I can't speak for all Protestants, but its predominant view is that contraception is okay, and that it's even encouraged and seen as just expected to do that without any real thinking as to what it really means morally. So that's interesting. That's definitely an interesting issue that got brought to your mind there.
Yeah. So that was something that I wrestled with, but I also had the sense that being against contraception was sort of the Catholic perspective, and I'd kind of be giving in if I said that. So I just kind of kept my Protestant, what I'd grown up with, because I don't like to give in. I'm not going to just give in willy-nilly on stuff. It took this whole journey took me years and years.
Yes.
So after Biola, I end up at the East Coast, and I'm interning. I get to intern at the Heritage Foundation out in Washington, D.C., which is really great. And it's a bunch of Catholics and evangelicals who are among the interns, and we all live in this little intern housing. So think of it as like, there's a sense in which it's like a little short-term semester-like college feel to it.
Okay.
And one of my roommates was a good Catholic friend of mine. His name is Robert, and we'd have, some of these kinds of discussions. Very respectful. He's really, smart guy. And he comes up one to me and he's like, Jared, you know that like contraception wasn't like accepted even by Protestantism until 1930, right? And I was like, I thought to myself, no, I didn't know that. I said, so I was basically like, what's your point? I wasn't going to say, no, I didn't know that. I was going to say, so. So anyways, that was, where I was at on those sorts of things. I end up, after doing several internships, moving to Arizona in 2017. And I only had one person that I knew in Phoenix. Her name was Tia, and she was Catholic. And so it's weird how the Lord puts you in certain places, certain times, and he even moves certain people around the country, I think in part for these sorts of purposes. Like several of these people who come into my life at this time in this story aren't from Phoenix, and I wasn't from Phoenix, but we all ended up in Phoenix at the same time. And after I became Catholic,
Wow.
and around the time I became Catholic, or soon after, we all left Phoenix.
Wow.
Isn't that weird?
That is so weird.
Yeah.
Divine providence is a mysterious thing.
It is. So I get a job working in Phoenix, and T and I, we go up to the North Country along with some of her friends, and we come back, and she's going to go to the Vigil Mass at the St. Mary's Basilica. And I'm the driver, so it would have been weird to just like drop them off and not have a way back for them. So I was like, well, I'll just come along with you because we'll see what this is about.
And this is your first ever Mass?
This isn't my first Mass. This is probably my third or fourth Mass. I've been to a couple of other Masses. Okay. But I always felt I had a hard time connecting.
Yeah.
I'm gonna say it that way. I had a kind of hard time connecting because I would recognize like just all the doctrinal distance that I had was very present at Mass. Like I remember specifically thinking to myself, I'm not going to kneel at communion because I don't actually believe that this is Jesus. Why would I kneel and communicate that?
Yeah.
So I was always I was always thinking that way. I was like, even if everyone else is Catholic in this room and everyone else is kneeling, I'm not going to because that would be wrong of me.
Yeah.
So I go to Mass, and it's really, this one's really worshipful, and I noticed that, and the music's really lovely. One of the hymns they say that they were singing is "I Heard the Voice of Jesus Say," which is a personal favorite of mine. Has become a personal favorite of mine, and there's something at that point. It's a very, I won't even call it, I can hardly call it even a religious experience, but there's something that just sort of speaks to me. And I feel like this is like a little door that I have to start thinking about. I have to really start thinking about this for some reason, which is really weird. I can't say that I had at that point some sort of religious experience with the Eucharist or anything else. I just had this sense I need to dig in.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the kind of person I am. I like to focus on these kind of intellectual questions.
Yeah. And what was your perception of Catholics or the Catholic Church growing up? Like, because you encountered different Catholics in your work at Heritage, and then your friend Tia, and so like, but what was like your perception of it? Just like you guys got a bunch of things wrong, or the Protestants kind of fixed everything, or kind of, yeah, what was your just general perception of Catholics? Or is it just like, I just don't know much, but I'm evangelical?
I didn't have a lot of Catholic friends growing up. I had a few. So it wasn't something that I had to think about too much.
Mm-hmm.
I guess I would say that I definitely held very strongly to Protestant distinctives on justification and such. And so I saw that as like the great error of Catholicism. And basically there was something in the Middle Ages, something that had happened that moved Catholicism away from its pristine founding to something that became a more works righteousness based system.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it took me, it's hard, I think, for Catholics who have always been Catholic to understand this, but words like indulgences, like you grow up Protestant and that just, there's like this reflex, like evil.
Yeah.
So I had some of that going on. And I also, as I was going through some of these things through Biola and through Heritage, I kind of saw like more liturgical forms of Christianity. Also through a kind of socio-political lens, like we're like, as Baptists, like this is my heritage and I kind of worship with the common man in a sense.
Mm.
And these more liturgical forms of Christianity I kind of associated with, these are the kind of intellectual class, and and there's a sense in which I felt like they kind of looked down on Baptists. Because some people I knew who had left Baptist, forms of Christianity for like Anglicanism or such, kind of looked back and, saw things that they had a reason for leaving, and they had, read certain things that said, well, I want to pursue something that, looks a little more patristic and such. And I didn't really realize that at the time, but I just had this sense that wasn't what I wanted. I wanted to worship the way I grew up.
Mm-hmm.
Like I had been giving something great. Why would I leave it? That was kind of the lens partially through which I viewed it. I even had this experience. I had gone to a exhibit at the John Paul II Shrine on Thomas More in Washington, D.C. This is at CUA. And afterwards, I had this run-in with a friend of a friend at this exhibit, and he introduced me as, this is kind of my Protestant friend. He's kind of like, checking out like, what you guys are about, because I'm not interested in Catholicism at this point. And so he says, by the way, Jared's Protestant. And she says, oh, not for long. I just had this sense, like, it just had this, like, this is so Catholic triumphalism. Of course you would say that. Of course you would say that. Like why do you don't even think that there's like something intellectually worthwhile here? Like I felt like, yeah, of course I'm going to remain Protestant. I'm not going to.
Yeah.
It just came off really bad and I didn't like it.
So then in Arizona, you had this experience which opened the door of like, okay, I'm actually going to dive deep and explore this and see what it's all about.
Exactly.
So then kind of what happened from there?
So I do a couple of things. I knew for some reason, Lord put this in my life, but someone who I read and respected really well, Carl Trueman, he would, on First Things, write about the writings of John Henry Newman. And I had this sense, I'm going to read Newman. That's like a perfect place to start. And I really thought at the time that I'm doing something really unusual. I'm a Protestant, I'm going to read John Henry Newman. I didn't realize just how many others have done this sort of thing before.
Yeah.
And what kind of Newman's meant for a lot of Protestants. But Newman's journey, I found very beautiful and very powerful. It was really compelling, his writing.
Mm-hmm.
He was very gifted at pointing out issues with his Protestantism in a way that I think a lot of people who grow up Catholic have a little bit of a harder time kind of pinpointing the problem with Protestantism. But Newman felt the problems very acutely.
Yeah.
He saw in the 1830s and 1840s these problems of German liberalism that were coming in and infecting his own Anglicanism. And Anglicanism was kind of beginning to develop various parties, kind of the liberal faction, evangelical faction, and an emerging Anglo-Catholic faction that Newman would help inaugurate. And there was a particular passage, there's a few passages that he crystallizes his thoughts so clearly and so well. I have it here.
Yes.
So I printed it out even because I just have to quote it so well. Newman talks about the rabble-rouser reformer who says, the Antichrist is the Pope is the Antichrist and all of this. And he says, actually, the shoe's on the wrong foot because Antichrist is the lawless one, the one who the one who exalts himself over religion and law. The spirit of lawlessness came in with the Reformation, and liberalism is its offspring.
Oh, wow.
And that was like a punch to the gut here, because Newman wasn't really offering me just an argument in a way. He was kind of offering me like an entirely new lens to read history through. He's like, because wherever you go, whether you see this in the decay of kind of mainline Protestantism in the United States as well as over in Europe, Protestant institutions, orthodoxy has a certain half-life.
Mm-hmm. And
so the reason why evangelical institutions exist is because, in large part, the fundamentalist modernist controversies of the 20th century, where many conservatives saw that within Protestantism, saw that they were kind of losing steam, and so they had to jump ship, as it were, because liberalism was taking over. When I say liberal theology, I'm talking about liberal theology, particularly for Catholics, like a denial of, say, the divinity of Christ, or someone who doesn't believe that in the virgin birth, just basic stuff in the creed.
Mm-hmm.
So I saw that this was happening, and I saw that this was happening not just in high church settings, but even in more evangelical settings. Like, I saw that non-denominationalism in particular was something that was really afoot. Non-denominationalism in many senses is a kind of an outgrowth, kind of post-World War II outgrowth in the United States, really of kind of our evangelical heritage, Baptist heritage, kind of revivalist traditions that converge and emerge very powerfully and have grown even within our lifetimes to become, I think, very much a dominant form of Christianity. But it's always very doctrinally, it works to make sure that there's only like just a couple of distinctives. There's like, your 10 or 12 point statement. And I thought this wasn't going to work in our day and age because there's too many issues that this isn't going to cover. And you can, I guess, always add a 13th or 14th doctrinal statement, but what if there's disagreement? So these things really bothered me. And Newman kind of brought this stuff to the fore for me. So I talk with some of my friends about John Henry Newman, and basically I get a response from one of them, a good friend of mine named Charles. He says, well, you ought to read the patristics. Jared, have you ever read Patristic Christianity? He's like, nope. So he said, well, start at the beginning and see what you think. Kind of retrace your steps. And so at this point, I pick up a volume, a little black penguin volume of the Apostolic Fathers. I'm sure you've done this. Did you have this moment in your journey?
Yeah, I mean, I read the letters of St. Ignatius of Antioch, and that blew my mind.
Yeah. So,
along with some of the other writings like the Didache and some of St. Justin Martyr, hearing his quotes, and St. Irenaeus, and Yeah.
I've come across Catholic sounding patristic quotes from Catholic apologetics organizations. I had never read the documents in their own context.
Yeah.
And so I felt that was really important to me. I felt like I couldn't really trust somebody, not that the Catholic apologetics organization wouldn't be doing something wrong, but like I felt like I wanted to play the game on its own turf, as it were.
Exactly.
So I go to, and it is, for me, it's the same thing. It's the letters of Ignatius of Antioch. And it's the same passage that lots of converts stumble upon over the Eucharist. In one of his letters, I think it's the letter to the Magnesians. I print this one out too because I have to quote it verbatim.
Yes.
Where is it? There it is. So he has Eucharistic language, and he even describes his martyrdom in Eucharistic language. So if you haven't read them, please do. But the passage here is regards the Docetist heresy. The Docetists believe that Christ was the phantom, a kind of proto-Gnostic group, I guess I would call them. And he says that these Docetists even absent themselves from the Eucharist and the public prayers because they will not admit the Eucharist is the self-same body of our Savior Jesus Christ, which suffered for our sins and which the Father in his goodness afterwards raised up. Consequently, since they reject God's good gifts, they have doomed themselves in their disputatiousness. This is the letter to the Smyrnians, which, if you remember, Smyrna is one of the places that the Apostle John writes to. Revelation. So how do I say this? Ignatius of Antioch doesn't have a anti-Protestant axe to grind because Protestantism wasn't around then. What is he doing? Well, he's saying a few things. He's saying, one, the Eucharist is basically saying it's apostolic. He's basically saying that it's dogma. It's not something you can agree to disagree on. I had this sense and this hope that early Christianity would be something where it wasn't really clear if Protestantism or Catholicism distinctives were present, and then later developments emerge. But that's not what I saw.
Yeah.
And at the beginning, that was that everything that basically Catholics and Eastern Orthodox share in common was like those things were present very early. So I gathered three things from Ignatius, and specifically this quote. Belief in the real presence happens very, very early in Christian history, and that it's dogma. And there's this third thing about this quote, and this took me a long time to kind of think through. but I'm pretty sure this is actually true. Ignatius says that these Docetists are heretics because of the way they don't believe in the divinity of Christ and these Eucharistic problems. He grounds the squabbling of heretics in their rejection of the Eucharist. They don't cohere as an organization, but they start splintering off because they've detached themselves from the Eucharist, of his language. And so I start thinking about that. And it reminds me, you see this in the Catholic Mass. Every Sunday, the priest talks about we are like basically one body to partake of this one loaf in the Eucharistic prayers. Is this language that kind of echoes St. Paul in 1 Corinthians 10. And the priest asks, God to unify his people by partaking of the body and blood of Christ. Every single Mass, this happens. And so the Eucharist for St. Paul brings unity. Withdrawing yourself from the Eucharist brings disunity. And I fast forwarded 1400 years and thought, oh, this is really problematic for me because the Catholics had retained the Eucharist and had remained one institution after the Reformation. And the people my people, Calvin, Luther, Zwingli, separated themselves from the Eucharistic body and began splintering, forming various movements that become modern Protestant traditions. So just as the Donatists had left the Eucharistic fold and doomed themselves in their disputatiousness, to quote Ignatius, so too had Protestants left the Eucharistic fold and doomed themselves in their disputatiousness. And this really, really hurt. And I remember thinking about this and thinking, this really makes me upset.
Wow.
Yeah.
And there's another passage, I think, from that same letter, because I've encountered some Protestants that are warming up to the idea of like, no, I actually do think that the Eucharist is the body and blood of Christ. I just don't think you need a priest to do that. But there's a specific passage in that letter by St. Ignatius of Antioch that says like only the Eucharist is considered valid when it's done by the bishop or one whom he designates. And so right then and there you have like apostolic succession and the authority of the bishop and the priest in union with the bishop, that outside of that there is no Eucharist. You can believe, you can believe whatever you want. You can believe that by jumping off that cliff you're not going to fall down, because of gravity, but that belief doesn't change reality, right? And so you can believe that you're partaking of the body and blood of Christ without a priest, but that doesn't make it the body and blood of Christ. In fact, that is an error. You're actually only partaking of bread and wine in that instance. Vice versa, as a Catholic, if you don't believe like that's the body and blood of Christ and it's been consecrated by the priest, well, it actually is, whether or not you believe it. Believing it helps you enter into the mystery of it, but it doesn't change the reality that there's like this change that happens that's outside of your authority of belief, and it happens through the authority of the Catholic Church.
I saw the same thing. Yeah. The way in which the Eucharist was connected to something that would become holy orders, basically.
Yes.
And I remember talking to my friend Ryan on the phone, and he who's Catholic, and he's basically saying, well, Jared, why wouldn't Lutheranism or Anglicanism work for you? And I said, well, because of this passage that you just bring up, Ignatius of Antioch. And because in the United States, at least, the conservative Lutherans don't have bishops. And so it's not really clear how they're connecting their doctrine of the real presence to the way in which the real presence, or how God ordains that, the real presence happen in this particular way, in this particular form. So I was basically stuck. I saw Ryan, I said, look, it's either Catholic or Orthodox. And again, just like I don't like to lose, and the fact that I don't have a lot of Orthodox people in my life, I was like, I'm going to check out Orthodoxy.
Yes.
I don't want to be Catholic, because everyone, like all of my Catholic friends are like, Jared, this is great. You're like on your way. And I'm like, no, I'm not. I'm going to go Orthodox. No, I'm just kidding. But like, there's a part of me that I'm very contrarian. And I really like to take my time on these things. And so there's a season of my life where I basically go, like 1 week I'll go to Divine Liturgy, and the next week I'll go to Mass. I just kind of do this every other week. And it's kind of weird and destabilizing. Like I have to tell the pastor at the church where I was at, look, I was at the time worshiping at a PCA church, Conservative Presbyterian church. It's like, I don't think I can keep doing this anymore.
Yeah.
It's really weird. It's very, but the thing is that because I moved to Arizona, I had a little bit of space. And you can tell, like, the way I'm doing this is, like, a lot of people would have, I think, more community in which they're pursuing this, but I just moved there. And so I'm kind of doing a lot of this on my own, reading things by myself online or in books. That's why my story is kind of the way it is. And so I feel very kind of alone and isolated, because I don't have a church community. I'm just kind of bobbing back and forth between these Eucharistic communions, trying to figure something out. And I really get in touch and stay in touch with this organization called Maggie's Place down in Phoenix. And Maggie's Place is a Catholic organization, the tradition of Dorothy Day, Peter Marr, and they operate houses of hospitality, basically for pregnant women and their babies. Now, what does any of this have to do with me becoming Catholic? Well, I was really struck with there was something very Catholic in, one, the people that would come to serve these women were often like very devout people. And the house of hospitality involves women who often move across the country to basically live in solidarity and poverty alongside these women who are going through something very hard, like having a child in very difficult, trying circumstances. And so I again had this connection through Tia, who was working there, and I would go. She just said, Jared, you ought to come, Saturday. And, so I washed the car and stuff, but I get to hang out with these little babies. And we live in very generationally isolated lives nowadays. Millennials hang out with other millennials, they go to college, or they go to their work that's kind of, might be dominated by particular strata of age range, but there was something very beautiful and precious about these really, really little people. And there was a way in which I saw that these women who would often become interested in the things of God in the process of having their child. And like, this was kind of brought up to me several times, that this is something that happens. And I wasn't really sure what to make of that for a while. And I thought about that. There was this verse that struck out to me as 1 it's in First Timothy where St. Paul talks about women who are saved through childbearing. And I didn't really know what to make sense of this verse as a Protestant, because why would you, if salvation is only a work of God, and you just, there's like, just believe on the Lord Jesus Christ and you'll be saved, you know, there's kind of this intellectual assent that's supposed to happen, then how would somebody be saved through childbearing in the Protestant soteriology? It was sort of like this Bible verse that didn't really fit the paradigm. And I saw that the Catholic way of thinking about soteriology could account for this Bible verse, because what was going on was the women, and I would see this, it wasn't just Bible Jared, but what I saw was that by having their child, they were being kind of caught up into the divine life, you might say, such that it was easy to hear from God. And that made sense of reality. And it was very beautiful. And I really liked that. I spent a lot of time as a Calvinist, and that sort of beauty was very foreign to me. It just sort of, it made me happy that that was the way things actually were. So I had that sort of experience that was going on at this time as well. But I've got orthodoxy to work through. I don't know if we have time to kind of keep going through that, or if we want
let's maybe wrap up in the next 5 to 10 minutes.
Okay. Yeah, do that. So I'll talk briefly about orthodoxy. And it's really beautiful. They kind of, I feel like when I was going to an Orthodox Divine Liturgy, that this is very, very old, which I really liked. And I saw like I remember one Sunday the bishop came and he goes to the bishop's chair. The Orthodox churches, and Eastern Catholic churches for that matter, will have a chair specifically for the bishop at all of their churches. And at this particular chair, there's an icon of Christ painted on it, and Christ is dressed like a bishop. And the priest kisses the icon, and it reminded me of Ignatius of Antioch, who talks about like the bishop presiding in the place of Christ, because that's exactly what was going on. The bishop like kissing the icon of Christ. It was a very that's ancient Christianity. I've not seen that before, but that is definitely ancient Christianity.
Wow.
And so why not become Orthodox, you know?
Yeah.
I want to, because I got this, like, I don't want to become Catholic to, you know, because I've got all these Catholic friends. So there's a few things that are going on. First, for me, the way I've talked about this story kind of sounds like it's a very intellectual sort of thing where I'm just sort of boom, boom, boom. But there's a very spiritual component, because even though I'm working through these problems, I also am going to Mass and trying to, I'm asking God, like during the consecration and when the priests and the ministers are distributing communion, like, God, what's happening here? And I have kind of a series of religious experiences in a Catholic context. And there's one in particular where I go forward, crossing myself when the priest there, and he gives me the blessing. And just a minute or so later, I just break out in tears. And I'm not a very charismatic type of person that does this. I very cranial, please just give me a book and Thank you. So it was there were several things that were going on, because I was realizing like that at that moment, that Christianity, the truth of the Eucharist, kind of caught me, as it were, into biblical times.
Mm-hmm.
And God was calling, like I felt like the fact that this had happened in a Catholic context for me indicated that God was pushing me home in this particular place. He was calling me home in this particular place, in this particular context. So that was one thing, probably the biggest thing. Papacy was also really important to me, because I really came to appreciate ecumenical councils. And how do I say this? Basically, when you think about Eastern Orthodoxy, it's not the only ancient Eastern communion. There's also the Oriental Orthodox communion. And there's also the Assyrian Church of the East. All of these have valid Eucharists, and they're all valid ancient Eastern Christian churches. But what happens is, every time you have a severance, whether it's at Chalcedon, kind of the monophysite controversy,
Mm-hmm.
the Easterners leave, and they never have something that they claim is an ecumenical council. And then the Eastern Orthodox, they leave. They don't leave. It's more like a slow divorce, to be technical. But they don't have anything that resembles an ecumenical council, and they don't really try to do something that seems like an ecumenical council. It's like only the Catholics retained that, and the Pope was the way in which that ancient practice continued into the present day. And everything that we've had that's been an ecumenical council has had some sort of papal quality to it. Like the Pope ratifies it or affirms it. Later, he eventually calls councils and, preside. Like there's something necessary about the institution of the papacy to maintain the institution of the ecumenical council.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was really, those things really ended up putting me into the Catholic side versus the Orthodox side at the end.
Wow. That's cool. Well, was there anything else that kind of gave you that final, like, okay, I'm 100% in, I'm becoming Catholic? Like, what was that day like, or that moment, or where you were like, okay, I realized this thing with Orthodoxy and my background, like, I'm going to do this. I'm going to become Catholic.
It was really hard because I didn't want to do something that would kind of disrupt, family dynamics and all of the rest. There's, the passage in the Catechism that talks about, this possibility of salvation outside the Catholic Church, but it takes pains to say that he who understands that the Catholic Church is the true church and would reject it anyway can't be saved. And I felt like I was playing footsies with that passage.
Wow.
I was kind of playing footsies with my soul. And that God was giving me a certain amount of time to read history, read these books, read online sites, and try and put things together. But I felt like I had this obligation. I felt just compelled. And I think part of it, and I haven't explained this, but this whole process, one of my friends encouraged me to start praying, and so I do. And I'm doing morning and evening prayer, and or sometimes I'll pray the rosary. And when I get to certain mysteries, there's the joyful mystery. I think it's the fourth mystery, is the presentation. The theme is kind of obedience. Mm-hmm. And, and that's the thing, presentation of the Lord is like this particular moment where Mary, our Blessed Mother, the Blessed Virgin Mary, and Saint Joseph follow the will of God by participating in this particular institution. They go to this particular place and they do this particular institution. And so there's certain mysteries like that where it's like, Jared, like, you have to do this too. Like, this is part of the Christian life.
Wow.
Is to do these things. So there were kind of certain moments like that sort of like, okay, fine.
Yeah. So, and how long have you been Catholic now?
2 years.
2 years. Wow.
Yeah.
That's amazing, Jared. And well, thanks for sharing your story with us. And any last words to our listeners? Maybe there is someone who's Protestant out there, or, exploring these different things. Like, what would your encouragement be to those who are in that kind of where you were, and how would you encourage them to, explore the Catholic Church?
I'd say take your time. I would say think about questions about early Christianity. Read early sources. Don't be satisfied with just, a Protestant lens. Like, try on the Catholic lens, and see if it explains more of reality. If you don't think it is, then, and God isn't showing that to you, then perhaps, there's something, blocking the answer. Like, yeah, of course that will be the case for a lot of people. But ask questions and don't be satisfied with if you find Bible verses that aren't lining up with what you've been given. Try other Christian traditions and see if it can explain more of the Bible.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Jared, for coming on the show, and like I said, sharing your story with us. I appreciate it, man.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for the work you guys do at Source and Summit and with this podcast.
Yep. Sounds good, brother. See ya.